So good evening, everybody. I think we should start. People might be coming for the next 5-10 minutes, but it has been a long day. So I'm going to say welcome to all of you. This is the fifth lecture in our autumn series, and we're very happy to introduce a new workshop, hybrid workshop, on a newly introduced series, namely Religious Studies Series. We're also very happy to host two Norwegian colleagues, Sven Thore Kloster, who is going to be our keynote speaker for tonight. Thank you so much for accepting this invitation. And Maristijn van der Lippe from KIFO and University of Bergen. But I will leave the floor to Kostas. I will hand over the floor to Kostas to formally introduce our speaker for tonight. Kostas Polisos has been the scientific advisor for this first workshop, where we explore comparisons, differences, various aspects of Orthodoxy and Protestantism. And this, we hope, is going to be the first of a series of workshops on the topic of Norway, Greece in terms of religious studies. Let me say just a few words about Kostas. He joined the Institute in 2022. He is formally an administrative assistant at the Institute, but he's finishing his PhD on Weber, Max Weber, and religious sociology of religion. Kostas holds a BA in welcome in sociology from Pantheon University and an MA from the Kapodistrian University in political science and sociology. So I'm very, very happy to also welcome Kostas to introduce the speaker and thank him so much for his work and dedication to make this happen. Thank you all for coming and enjoy the lecture.
Okay, and thank you, Delia. Just want to say that without you, this wouldn't have been possible. I'm very happy to present Sven for this keynote lecture, which is, as you heard, it's part of our workshop that we had during the day titled Cuius, regio, How Religion Shaped the Modern Histories of Norway and Greece, and which is, I hope, the first of many academic events of our newly found Religious Studies Series that we inaugurated today. I wanted to take this opportunity and thank everyone who presented. And I have to doubly thank Sven because not only he is giving us this lecture, but he also presented a very interesting paper in the morning, and he's also part of the organizing committee. So as you understand, he had a very heavy load today. So I appreciate everything. Thank you, Sven. And so, few words for Sven. Sven Thore Kloster is director of KIFO, Institute of Church, Religion and Worldview Research in Norway. He received his PhD in systematic theology from the University of Oslo. And his research engages questions at the intersection of theology and the sociology of religion, with particular attention to political theology, religion and politics, global Christianity, and interreligious relations. He has published widely in these fields, authoring and co-editing several books as well as numerous scholarly articles. So, without further ado, please join me in welcoming Sven, who is giving us what I am sure will be a fascinating lecture on church-state relations in Europe.
Thank you. Thank you, Kostas. So thank you, Kostas. And thank you, first of all, to the Norwegian Institute in Athens for welcoming me and inviting me here. And thanks to you for coming here. And also thanks to, where are you? Sitting probably there, following the lecture on Zoom. As has been said, we had a wonderful workshop today, very much about state and church. So we will follow. That was in Norway and in Greece, but I will follow up that theme today in my lecture. So I will probably keep going for maybe 40-45 minutes, and then we will have time for discussion and Q&As. Okay, so wonderful. Visiting Athens and the Greek world 700 years after the Council of Nicaea is a timely opportunity, I think, to reflect on the role of state religion in Europe today. And as we all know, the strong bonds between state and church that emerged with Constantine have been challenged since the dawn of Enlightenment. I put together some quotations here just for us to tune into the secular discourse. Since then, there has been a long line of European philosophers who have advocated the separation of religion and politics, and particularly of church and state. Now, in our time, this has increasingly become a characteristic of the established political discourse on religion in Europe, a credo of the separation of church and state. And my next slide just shows this continuing lineage with the famous politicians in Europe, at least in North Europe. So over the years, the very idea of separation of church and state has become part of the imagery of what Europe is, of what it means to be a European, of European identity. Europe sees itself as a secular exception in a religious world. And as José Casanova has pointed out, this self-image is itself a product of modern European history rather than an empirical reality. Europe's secular identity is as much a narrative as a condition. Now, Casanova, he distinguishes between different meanings of secularization: the differentiation, decline, and privatization. And he argues that only the first, the differentiation of religion from other spheres, is universal. In the European context, however, all three dimensions have been conflated and turned into an identity marker. So in this sense, the separation of church and state functions less as a sociological description than as a symbolic boundary of what it means to be European. But yet, if we move from Europe's self-description to the actual governance of religion, the picture becomes more complicated, as we have also discussed today. The process of differentiation are rather complex, or the processes, in plural, are complex. I think there are good reasons to cherish the separation of church and state as an ideal. So don't get me wrong. But I also think it's misleading to consider the separation of state and church a characteristic of Europe today. It simply doesn't match the facts on the ground. So in this lecture, this evening, I will give examples of contemporary configurations of church-state relations in various European countries and demonstrate, at least try to demonstrate, that the ties between state and church are often stronger than we think, even as churches also lose symbolic and hard power. So that is very much what I will do tonight or this evening. I will show you different examples from different European countries. And before I start to do that, I will use just some words on the classification. Because the classification of church-state systems, at least in Western Europe, has traditionally been based on a tripartition. So that is the language, the categories we are used to. They are identified variously as separation systems, concordat system, on concordatarian systems, it's hard to pronounce, and national church systems. Okay, these three types are used in talking about church-state relations. And as I will explain later, welcome. This traditional classification is of little use for understanding what is going currently on in the church-state relations in Europe. It blurs, this model, I think, blurs more than it explains. But nevertheless, it is helpful as a starting point and for structuring the presentation of the different countries, which I now will begin. And I begin with the concordat countries. The concordat countries, or the concordatarian system, refers to how predominantly Catholic countries regulate their relationship with the Catholic Church through bilateral treaties with the Vatican. These treaties are known as concordats. These agreements recognize the country's autonomy and establish it as a privileged partner of the state, defining mutual rights and obligations. While not necessarily creating an official state religion, concordats grant the Catholic Church a special legal and symbolic status. Other faith communities may also reach agreement with the state, but these are typically less comprehensive. Most concordat states were historically Catholic, but are now formally secular, maintaining close institutional and cultural ties with the Catholic Church. And examples include Italy, Spain, Portugal, Austria, Poland, Croatia, and Ireland, for example. Ireland has no state church, but the state has formed close links with the Catholic Church, particularly through education. The Catholic Church actually owns and runs almost 90% of all the primary schools in Ireland. Church members have priority when admission offices prepare for new school years. And where places are in short supply, Catholic children get priority. So that is one example from Ireland. Poland is another example of a secular state, formally speaking, with no state church. Yet there is strong cooperation between the state and the Catholic Church, both formally, based on the 1993 Concordat, as well as informally, of course. Although religious education is optional, more than 90% of Polish pupils receive Catholic religious education in the public schools. The teachers are paid by the state, but appointed by the church, which also approves the textbooks. Besides, the Catholic Church runs universities and hospitals that the state finances on par with state universities and state hospitals. Church institutions pay less in taxes than other institutions, and the state also pays for chaplains in hospitals, prisons, and in the army. Poland is also well known for the informal influence of the church on, for example, ethical questions and family politics, the regulation of abortion and reproductive health, for example. So that is the Polish example. Italy is perhaps the most well-known example of a concordat state. The Lateran Treaty of 1929, here signed by Mussolini and the Vatican Secretary of State, Cardinal Gaspari, still regulates the relationship between the secular Italian state and the Catholic Church. Although the state church was formally abolished in 1984, and the Constitution guarantees religious freedom, the ties between state and church remain strong. The state, for example, maintains most of Italy's churches, and there are quite some churches in Italy, I can tell you. And the public schools offer Catholic religious education. Teachers are paid by the state, but appointed by the church, as in Poland. Other recognized faith communities, Protestants, Jewish, Muslim, Orthodox Christians, may provide religious instruction in public schools, but their teachers are not state-funded. A unique feature of the Italian system is the 8 per mille tax system, which allocates 0.8% of each citizen's income tax to a religious community or to the state for social causes. Now, while citizens cannot opt out whether to pay this tax or not, they can choose the recipient of the tax. So, unsurprisingly, the Catholic Church receives the vast majority of these funds. But an interesting detail, I think, and I will give some fun facts throughout the lecture. So the fun fact about Italy is that the small Valdensian church, that is a small Protestant church with only about 25,000 members in Italy, it receives nearly 4% of the total tax. And that is about 100 times more than its membership share. So that's likely reflecting its reputation as a liberal and socially engaged community, and perhaps also a quiet protest by Catholic taxpayers. Okay. Malta and Liechtenstein illustrate how concordate states can coexist, or concordate systems can coexist with an official state religion. So in both of these countries, Catholicism is constitutionally recognized as a state church, even though freedom of religion is formally guaranteed as well. This arrangement gives the Catholic Church a privileged position in political, economic, and cultural life, as well as in national symbolism. In Malta, Catholicism also shapes public education and moral legislation, while in Liechtenstein, the Church retains a central role in civic ceremonies and enjoys very much financial advantages. So all these examples show that even within formally secular frameworks, concordate states may maintain an explicitly confessional identity, blending constitutional freedom with significant religious privilege. So that was the concordate states. And now we move on to the next category of states, the category of national churches. On the non-Catholic side, several countries maintain a special relationship with one dominant church. These have traditionally been labeled state churches, though many have undergone reforms, so it is not clear whether they can be characterized as state church anymore, particularly if one understands state church as a narrow juridical concept. So in this lecture, I use the broader category of national church to describe such arrangements. National churches are found in the Lutheran Nordic countries, in the United Kingdom, and in several of the Orthodox countries in Eastern and Southern Europe, including Romania, Bulgaria, Greece, and Cyprus. And despite varying degrees of autonomy, these churches continue to hold a distinctive public status that blurs the line between religion and nation. Here are some of the Orthodox scenes. Greece, as we have also talked a lot about today, is perhaps one of the countries of this category that actually can be described as having a state church. The Greek Orthodox Church enjoys privileges and is formally recognized in the constitution as the prevailing or dominant religion of the Greek state. Priests are civil servants, state employees, paid directly by the state. The state funds theological education and maintains church buildings as cultural heritage. The Orthodox Church and its institutions enjoy tax exemptions and property privileges. Religious instruction in public schools is Orthodox by default, although opt-outs are possible. as we've also talked about today. Major state ceremonies include Orthodox rituals. So I think the Greek Orthodox Church qualifies as a state church in the formal sense. But of course, you are the experts on Greece, so I leave it to you to decide. So please disagree with me on that if you like. We can come back to that, I guess. Romania provides a clear example of a national church without formal establishment. The Romanian state is officially secular, and its constitution declares that all religions are equal before the law. Yet the Orthodox Church is explicitly named in the constitution and recognized for its, I quote, important role in national history and in the life of society. That's Article 7. This grants it a constitutionally endorsed cultural and symbolic primacy, despite claims of religious equality. The Romanian Orthodox Church plays a central role in national ceremonies, in education, in the media, and benefits from substantial public funding, including subsidies, tax exemptions, and state contributions to clergy salaries and church construction. And I guess similar arrangements exist in many of the other Orthodox majority countries, such as Bulgaria, Serbia, and Cyprus. None of these has a formal state church. Still, the Orthodox Church retains a privileged status as the traditional and dominant religion, enjoying political influence, economic advantages, and a strong role in shaping national identity. So that was the Orthodox part of Europe. In the Nordic region, which I'm more familiar with, as you can see, there are many crosses in the flags. The various models of national church, there are many various models of national churches in the Nordic region. Iceland and Denmark can both be described as genuine state church systems, I think, due to explicit confessional references in their constitutions. In Iceland, the state collects a membership fee from all citizens and redistributes it to registered faith communities according to their size, while also providing direct financial support to the National Lutheran Church. Most Icelandic clergy are state employees. In Denmark, the constitution defines the Lutheran Church as the Danish folk church, rather than the state church. Yet its structure remains deeply intertwined with the state. Clergy are civil servants, as in Greece, and the Minister of Church Affairs is politically responsible for the church. He or she also formally appoints the bishops, although the appointments are based on who receives the most votes in local elections. Church law is adopted by the parliament, meaning the church lacks full autonomy. And the monarch, the Danish monarch, is constitutionally required to be a member of the Danish folk church. The Danish state also collects church tax and funds maintenance of church buildings and grants tax exemptions. The church performs several public functions, such as administering cemeteries and maintaining the national, birth register in Denmark is kept by the church, and regardless of religious affiliation. So the fun fact about Denmark is that if you're an atheist or a Muslim and you get a baby, then you will get your child's birth certificate from the Lutheran Church. Finland, in its 1919 constitution, stated that it no longer had a state church, but instead has two national churches, the Finnish Orthodox Church and the Finnish Evangelical Lutheran Church. Both churches in Finland are given constitutional recognition and are public law institutions, meaning they are part of the state's legal system. But unlike Denmark, they are self-governing in their internal affairs. Both receives various financial and symbolic benefits from the state, and other faith communities can apply to be registered as an official faith community, and as such receive support based on their membership numbers. But no tax concessions, however, are given to the other registered faith communities, only to the two national churches. Norway and Sweden officially abolished their state churches just a few years ago. Sweden in 2000 and Norway in 2012 or 2017, depending on how you count. Up to 2012, the Norwegian government appointed bishops in the Church of Norway. And that has now ended, but the church is inscribed in the constitution as to remain the established Church of Norway, and as such be supported by the state. And the king, the monarch, is actually still constitutionally obliged to, I quote, confess the evangelical Lutheran religion, whatever that is. In both countries, there are close ties between the national church and the state. And the state grants the church various privileges, including cultural, symbolic, juridical, and economic. In Sweden, the state collects the church tax for the church, while in Norway, the state provides direct funding for the church. Other registered faith communities receive direct support based on the number of their members and the size of the amount given to the Church of Norway. Each country's church has its own set of church laws. For example, both the Church of Norway and the Church of Sweden are required by law to be present in all parts of the country and to be evangelical Lutheran folk churches. The churches are also required to be democratic churches and therefore to hold public elections for their parish councils and their national synods every 4th year. So that is according to national legislation. And this again raises actually another question of what it means to be a state church, but from a different perspective. So both Norway and Sweden have officially abolished the state church, yet the state has designed the new church law that regulate much of the church's life. The state set the condition for granting the church's separation. And does that mean that they're still state churches, I wonder? At least that's a legitimate question. Okay, we move on to United Kingdom, which represents yet another way of having a national church, or more precisely, actually two national churches. In England, the monarch serves as supreme governor of the Church of England, which is legally defined as the established church. The monarch must remain in communion with the church and vow to uphold the Anglican faith. At the same time, however, the monarch is also a member of the Church of Scotland and promises to defend Presbyterianism during the coronation. So the British sovereign actually embodies two confessional traditions, both Anglican and Presbyterian Reformed, reflecting the country's, of course, complex political religious foundations. Both churches are regulated by law, but their relations to the state differ significantly. The Church of Scotland enjoys autonomy and in its internal affairs, while the Church of England the structure and doctrine of the Church of England are still subject to parliamentary approval, as in Denmark. Major church legislation must pass both houses of parliament and receive royal assent as well in the Church of England. The monarch appoints bishops after nominations from the church, and they sit in the House of Lords, directly linking church and state. And as we also talked about earlier today, despite this institutional prominence, the Church of England no longer commands a majority of members. The Catholic Church, for example, surpasses it. And most Britons belong to no church at all. So that is the majority in the UK. Yet the Church of England, as a minority church, remains a powerful national symbol, deeply woven into public life and ceremony. Bishops open daily sessions in Parliament with prayer, and the church plays a very visible role in royal and civic rituals. Financially, however, it differs from other national or state churches. It reaches no public funding, but sustains itself through property income, donations, and investments. So the British example is that you have a very strong symbolic state church, but no public funding. The English model illustrates how establishment can persist symbolically and constitutionally, even when religious belief and participation have sharply declined. A reminder that national churches may endure as cultural institutions long after their societal dominance fades. Okay, and we move on to the third group. The third group of countries is the one where church and state have been separated. The separation, let's call them the separation countries. It has been separated in more principled and explicit ways. In these countries, there are clear separations of church and state in the constitutions. No religion is juridically privileged, and secularism is officially embraced. Examples of such countries are France, the Netherlands, the Czech Republic, Belgium, and also Germany, although that can be discussed. That's up for discussion. Nevertheless, despite the neutrality and secularity, there are still many practical arrangements in which Christianity, or a specific church, is privileged in these countries as well. And I will now show you some of these examples. And we start with France, which is probably the best known example of a separationist country. Guided by the principle of laicite, the Republic officially broke ties with the Catholic Church in 1905, declaring a very strict separation between state and church. In theory, the state neither interferes in religious affairs nor favors any faith. In practice, however, it continues to support religion in multiple ways, especially the Catholic Church. The state, for example, maintains all Catholic churches and vicarages built before 1905. Therefore, it also financed the restoration of the Notre Dame Cathedral, which we saw a few years ago after the fire. Religious private schools also receive public funding in France, and about 20% of French primary school pupils attend Catholic schools. So 20% of the pupils go to Catholic schools in the secular France, and their teachers are paid by the state. There are tax benefits for donations to faith communities and state-funded chaplaincies in some prisons, hospitals, and in the armed forces. But even more, the fun fact about France concerns the region of Alsace-Lorraine, the region in France where the most apparent exception from laicite is found. Here, churches and Jewish communities still receive direct public from the state. The arrangement dates back because that region came under German rule in 1870, and the 1905 laws were never implemented after the region returned to France again after World War I. So that is the historical reason. And as a result, actually today the French president continues to appoint the Archbishop of Strasbourg. And this illustrates that even the most secular republic in Europe remains deeply entangled with its religious past. Belgium next. Also, Belgium upholds a strict separation of church and state formally and has no official religion. Yet the state spends around 700 million euros annually on salaries, housing, and pension for clergy in recognized communities: Catholic, Protestant, Anglican, Orthodox, Jewish, Muslim, and also non-religious humanist association. This model, known as cooperative secularism, also includes state funding for religious education in schools, chaplaincy services in the army, in prison, and in hospitals, and the maintenance of religious buildings. Officially, all recognized communities are treated equally, but the Catholic Church retains certain symbolic privileges despite the lack of concordat. The government and royal family, for example, still participate in key Catholic ceremonies. And the fun fact about Belgium is that the Vatican ambassador traditionally serves as the dean of the diplomatic corps. So he's sort of the chief of the foreign diplomats. Reminders of how historical ties and symbolic hierarchies persist within Belgium's otherwise secular framework. The Netherlands shares some of Belgium's liberal tradition, but has adopted a different model of governing religion, one that can be characterized as neutral pluralism. I think the Netherlands perhaps is the European country with the most apparent separation between church and state, not France. Contrary to Belgium and France, in Netherlands, the Netherlands does not fund any religious community directly. Neither does it recognize any religious community. All religious communities are private juridical entities. So the state doesn't care, they don't have this system of recognized religion or not. All religions are just private organizations. Public schools are secular with no religious teaching. The state, nevertheless, funds private religious schools and pays chaplains' salaries in public institutions. It also provides tax deductions for gifts to religious communities, like in France. So there are some indirect support. Last example, Germany. Germany represents a special case among the separationist countries. It combines a constitutional separation of church and state with a concordat with the Catholic Church due to its history of being both Protestant and Catholic. The relationship is built on cooperation rather than strict division, somewhat similar to the Belgian model. The state recognizes certain religious communities, Catholic, Protestant, Orthodox, Jewish, and some Muslim, and some humanist, depends on the different Bundesländern, and collects their tax on their behalf. It also supports religious education in public schools, funds private religious schools, and helps maintain religious buildings. Most strikingly, however, the churches play a central role in the welfare sector. That is the big thing about Germany. That's why you have the picture here of the Charité hospital in Berlin. Catholic and Protestant organizations run a large share of Germany's hospitals and social services, all publicly financed. In fact, Caritas, the Catholic Caritas, and the Protestant Diaconie together form the country's second largest employers after the state itself. with around 1 million employees. So a vivid example of how deeply intertwined church and state remain in contemporary Germany. I could have continued with more countries. I will not, but I think I've offered enough examples to prove my point, namely that church and state are still very much entangled in Europe, not only in Norway, not only in Greece, but all over Europe, despite the long tradition and engagement in separating politics and religion on the continent. So let me conclude by drawing 3 brief observations. First, state and church are not as separate as they seem, not even in the so-called separationist countries. France, for instance, remains deeply involved in religious affairs despite its laïcité principle. If we compare, or when we compare France with, for example, the UK, we find that the secular republic supports religion, and then primarily Catholic Church, with more public money than the officially established Church of England receives from the British government. Yet the narratives about the two countries differ fundamentally. So this suggests that the separationist model functions perhaps more as a self-description than as an empirical category. So that was my first reflection. My second point is that 700 years after Constantine, we still struggle with the concept of a state church. What does it mean? While traditional models have been formally dismantled, specific church laws still make the old churches subject to parliamentary legislation on internal affairs. And new regulatory frameworks still allow many of these churches to operate as de facto state churches. So if we want to understand the entanglement between church and state today, we need to look beyond constitutional labels. We need to look to cultural privileges, to financial arrangements and tax concessions, to material property, to the education system, to constructions of cultural heritage and national identity, to welfare partnerships, to symbolic roles, family politics, and various forms of access to public space and to media, just to mention some fields. And there are undoubtedly many more. So we need to have this broad perspective, not the narrow juridical state church perspective. That was the second point. And the third point, the third and last point, is today, most European countries are religiously diverse and pluralistic societies. However, increasing religious diversity and new equality policies have not reduced the state's control over religion. Instead, they have transformed it by funding, registering, or supervising minority faith, religion, or life stances. States incorporate them into public administration. This development resonates with Talal Assad's argument that secularism is not the withdrawal of the state from religion, but its reconfiguration. The state defines and manages what counts as religion or non-religion. Secular states continuously produce the religious sphere they claim to keep separate by regulating its institutions, funding its activities, and shaping its public visibility. In that sense, churches and faith communities, and also life stance communities, become administrative partners to the state rather than independent counterparts. So the European state-church relationship has not disappeared, but has transformed from formal establishment to diffuse governance, from faith to heritage, and from institution to regulation. perhaps I'll dare to say that the state church is not dead, it has spread. So that is the legacy from Nicaea. Thank you for listening. This was
Thank you very, very much.
This was some of the fun facts.
Thank you very much, Sven. This wonderful and very eye-opening lecture, and I, for one, I'm gonna think differently about the church-state relations, and I agree with your statement that we shouldn't focus on the theoretical terminology of these relations, but we should have a broader view of it. I'm gonna open the floor to the audience if anybody has any questions. Excellent.
Thank you very much for this lecture. Very interesting in putting together these systems and the fun stuff as well. First of all, I have a question on the conclusion, the second point of your conclusion. If we broaden up the discussion about all the criteria about state church separation, that way, is there an option in the future to have actually separation of church and state, or if it's too broad, we will never have separation of church and state? Because through this approach, it means that all of these relationships have to stop to define a system as completely separated. And another one, I don't know if you have reflected on that. Sometimes I'm reflecting on this about the Greek case. If we reverse the question and ask if the church is secularized through its connection with the nation, through receiving all this money to proceed in many other activities, compare it with maybe an ideal type, to use the Weberian term of religion and the church, how it should be from the very beginning. And now we see churches, let's talk about Christian churches, that have been actually secularized, come in the world, have economic relations with the state, other type of relations, etc.
What was the second question was?
If we could talk about the secularization of the church.
Oh, yeah, very much. I think so. We are all secular. But yeah, good questions. So the first question was, yeah, this broad perspective. No, first of all, I'm not in favor of saying, I'm not trying to be normative to say what should be done. So it's purely from an analytical point of view. Much of the state church research focused on the juridical, so defining what is a state church is strictly juridical terms. So my point is just to say that if we are to study state church relations, we should have a very broad perspective, because there are so many, and the tripartition doesn't make very much sense, because it blurs more than it explains, because there are so many. These relations are so intertwined, more than the juridical. So that was my point. And I don't have any opinion, sort of, whether it should be more loose or I think what it shows is that it shows that the history of the country is I mean, there are so many histories in Europe. Each country has their own history, and the arrangement they differ due to the different histories, and that's what we also see in France. Due to France's Catholic past, they don't manage to operate this principle of laicite. So I guess that's what's going on. I mean, the politics of governing religion in all European countries that's contested in many countries, and I think it's a mix of it relates to equality ideals, and it relates to ideals of secularity from the Enlightenment, from the philosophers, and it relates to historical bonds and cultural norms, so it's not surprisingly that it's contested. And your second question is whether the arrangement sort of is also secularizes the churches. Good question. I think definitely in the Norwegian setting, that's what I am most familiar with. The state, as long as this church was a state church, the state was in control of, for example, appointing the bishops. And I think that is fair to say that due to the state, the church got more liberal bishops than it would. The first female bishop, for example, was due to the state's decision, not the church itself, whatever that is. Yeah. So at least in Norway, I think it's fair to say that the state has pushed the church in a more progressive direction. But that can be, debated. That's fine. So whether that is secularization or not, I don't know. Probably. Yeah.
Any other questions?
I just thought about for my part, coming from Denmark.
Oh, okay. Wonderful.
Yeah, I was just thinking that in our country, it's clear that it's been a bit muddy, the definition of the line between state and church. But I think it shocked very many people very recently when our state prime minister went out to say that we were required to do I think you translate it as, I guess, spiritual awakening, only oprusting.
Yeah.
And kind of called upon the church and the faculties of art to take upon the challenge of the situation. Obviously enforced by the geopolitical situation that we're facing, but I'm wondering if it's like a dance that kind of is due to when the geopolitics are becoming more and more complex, if the church is then brought back in as a kind of a way to seek help in the times of need or whatever, but like this traditional role that it kind of is being brought back into, or seems that it's becoming more important again due to the situation.
Yeah, very much.
Yeah. Asking for like if there's a clear return again towards even more unification between the two.
Well, I think it's hard to get even a stronger unification between church and state in Denmark than there already is, because it's very strong. But of course, in terms of individual faith and in terms of cultural identity, I think that's the case.
Yes.
That's what we see, the revival of Christianity as a sort of culturalized identity issue in many secularized countries. And I think Denmark is a good example of how far the state goes in asking for a religious revival. Sort of, what you say is correct. The Danish prime minister sort of said we need a religious revival. But that is, of course, I would say that is a nationalist, maybe also xenophobic political strategy. But that's churches are no longer the only ones who owns Christianity, right? So Christianity is in play. It's being negotiated by many different actors, by churches, of course, but also by politicians, by parties, by different institutions. So there is a constantly fight about what Christianity or church is. And when it comes to migration or national identity, I think that is where one place where you actually see this clash, because many of the churches would, for example, argue in favor of welcoming the stranger, while those political parties that often claim to be Christian or maintaining Christian heritage would many times be the parties that do not want more refugees, for example.
Right.
Yes, just follow up on that. I think this was really very interesting to see the different ways of handling the relation between state and churches. I just wonder if you have looked into how the state treat their minorities, because I think that's another way to look at the state-church relationship. How do the states treat the diversity in society? That's a bit like your question, because I think in Denmark it's not about a religious revivals as such, it's a Christian revival, right? And I think what we see in Europe now is a move towards conservative Christianity. So I wonder if the Lackmus test is how they treat their minorities. And you have seen differences in how they do that.
Very good question. That was what came to my mind when I worked through this. So that is part 2 of the study. I've started a little and I gave you some glimpses, but there are clearly big differences. Some of and the interesting thing is that, as far as I can see so far, the equality policies, at least in practice, they don't necessarily correspond to the level of state church. So for example, in Britain, where there is clearly a state church or 2 state churches, they have kind of inclusive policies. Whereas in France, where there is clearly not a state church, they have kind of discriminatory practices against Islam. So it doesn't correspond. It's very interesting to see what you bring up here. So the answer is no, I haven't. That is part 2 of the study, but it's very interesting to do that, to see how they govern pluralism, how that links to the state church situation.
There's a question on, we should also thank our online participants. I heard that we have many.
Okay, wonderful.
So yeah, Costas Surprises asks, how can we approach methodologically the historical coexistence of Greek Orthodox Church and state and their behavior towards other Christian denominations during the long 19th century? I'm thinking about the propaganda fide and Protestant missionaries in Greece at the time during the early and the whole of 19th century, especially the Americans that promoted a more secular form of a Greek state and church that didn't want to change but to heal. But at the same time, they introduced a schooling system of strict Protestant education of young girls and women. How can a secular education coexist with a dogmatic form of addressing young pupils in a non-multi-religious, almost hostile to other denominations context? So the question is, how can a secular education, like the one they introduced, the Protestant missionaries during the 19th century, introduced in Greece, coexist with a dogmatic form of addressing young pupils in a context that is non-multi-religious. There is a dominant religion that is almost hostile to other denominations, to minority religions. How can these two coexist? You think? Have you?
I have no answers for that. I haven't. I mean, Maria should probably answer. She has studied religious education. I haven't. I have no clues about that.
Basically, it's another question about pluralism too, but in the more where the dominant religion is.
But I can add one comment on some of my previous work, and that has been the politics of freedom of religion. So freedom of religion is a very contested right, okay? There is no consensus of what it actually means globally. So there are many different ways of framing and interpreting the UN Charter, for example. And the Americans, many times they bring freedom of religion as a demand in negotiations and so on. And many countries would be hesitant to that, because when they hear Americans talk about freedom of religion, they hear missionaries coming. So that was, of course, the case in Greece, but particularly in the Middle East, and also in India and Sri Lanka and so on. So the politics of freedom of religion is, of course, very, very important, fundamental human rights and so on. But the politics of it is, for example, when the US negotiated its bilateral trade agreement with Guatemala, the US demanded, based on freedom of religion, that Guatemala was to open its public school sector for private schools. And the result was that the evangelical US school industry came into Guatemala and offered lots of private primary schools. So that was done in the name of freedom of religion. Nowadays, that was some years ago. Nowadays, freedom of religion is also interpreted not only as an individual right, but as a collective right. So that is the case in the US now with this bakery, this baker refusing to bake a cake for a gay couple, right? So I think the court has agreed that the bakery is entitled to refuse making gay cakes due to freedom of religion. So it's very, very much a contested right and politicized right. That doesn't mean we should not talk about it. It's important to talk about it, but in political context, it's heavily contested what it means, actually. So that was just a general comment, but I don't know. Maybe you can, or others can, about this education thing. That's not my area.
You want to start?
Do we have more questions?
No, so far no. But
we should have another workshop on freedom of religion. Yeah, that's very interesting.
So maybe we can continue with a glass of wine.
I'd love to.
Yes, and feel free to move to the next room, and let's give a hand to our speakers for today: Alexander Sekelariou, Nazir Nazar, Marie Steiner von der Lippe, and last but not least, Sven Thore Kloster.
And the two of you.
Thank you so much.